A new piece in the New York Times looks at examples of when political leaders meddle in government data, proving it rarely ends well. The article reads in part, quote, "There is the case of Greece, where the government faked deficit numbers for years, contributing to a debilitating debt crisis that required multiple rounds of bailouts. The country then criminally prosecuted the head of the statistical agency when he insisted on reporting the true figures, further eroding the country's international standing. There is the case of China, where earlier this century, the local authorities manipulated data to hit growth targets mandated by Beijing, forcing analysts and policymakers to turn to alternative measures to gauge the state of the country's economy. Perhaps most famously, there is the case of Argentina, which in the 2000s and 2010s systematically understated inflation figures to such a degree that the international community eventually stopped relying on the government's data. That loss of faith drove up the country's borrowing costs, worsening a debt crisis that ultimately led to it defaulting on its international obligations. Joining us now, the author of that piece, chief economics correspondent for the New York Times, Ben Castleman. Ben, thanks for coming on. Great piece, and not great examples for Trump to be following.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are historical parallels, not many of them in the U.S., but around the world, and none of those are examples that you would want to emulate, right? You mention Argentina, where we ended up, where they fired the people responsible for producing inflation data when the inflation was looking bad. That sounds pretty familiar right now. That didn't stop inflation, right? If anything, it allowed inflation to spiral further out of control without the evidence to, set policy. And it really undermined the country's credibility internationally, drove up its borrowing costs, added to a debt crisis. The Greek example, I think, is really striking because they didn't just fire the head of their statistical agency. They criminally prosecuted him for years. And this is somebody who insisted on reporting accurate data on the country's deficits to its citizens and to its lenders worldwide. And they prosecuted him. And I spoke to him over the weekend. And he made the point that, we talk about how data is important for decision making, for the Fed, for policy, but really it's important to democracy, right? Fundamentally, the reason we need this data is so that we, the citizens, can hold our leaders accountable. Elizabeth, my colleague, mentioned it earlier, right, that the inflation was a key part of why Joe Biden lost or Kamala Harris lost the last election. And if we don't have accurate data, then we don't have the ability to hold our leaders responsible for Congress, for the courts, but for the citizens.
Good morning, Ben, and a great story. And I was alarmed to see that Janet Yellen, the former Treasury Secretary, Fed chair, said this was likening the United States to a banana republic, which is.
And she's not somebody prone to hyperbole, I don't think.
No. But let me ask you a question. It was about your excellent piece. How far away are we from the example of Argentina, which you gave, which was so alarming that eventually Argentina defaulted on its loans because people had lost such confidence internationally? I mean, what has to happen here before we get that far?
I mean, I think we're at a critical juncture here, right? The person who has taken over from Dr. McIntyre at the BLS on an acting basis is a longtime civil servant himself. He's somebody who is widely respected. If he's able to keep these processes in place, continue to produce reliable data, if he's empowered to do that, then look, Dr. McIntyre wasn't the person producing these numbers, right? She's, the top of an agency that has, hundreds of professionals who do this work. So if that work is allowed to continue, then fine. But I think that the risk is that somebody gets put in who is just going to try to give numbers that the president wants, and that undermines confidence. Frankly, even if the numbers remain good, there are going to be a lot of questions around them. I asked Janet Yellen over the weekend if we get a better than expected jobs report, a better than expected inflation report next month, is she going to question those numbers? And she said she has to at least have that in the back of her mind.
Ben, so put this in the context of the uncertain environment that investors are facing at the moment. Say you're wanting to invest in a new business, or you're wanting to build a factory in Missouri, and you're thinking about it, and you're relying on government data, and you're relying on some certainty in economic policy. How does this play into the general environment of uncertainty for companies that are struggling with making those kind of CapEx decisions at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, we're just in this incredibly uncertain environment, right? We're already in this situation where you don't know what tariff policy is going to be from one day to the next. You don't know what immigration policy is going to be from one day to the next, right? The president comes out and says, we're not going to go after workers in restaurants and farms, and then sort of reverses that the next day. But I think until now, we've at least been in the case that we know what the numbers are, right? We trust the numbers. And so even if you can't always rely on what the president is saying about policy, you can at least rely on the numbers coming out of the administration. If this undermines that, that's a real step and a real blow, I think, to the confidence that businesses, that investors domestically and internationally are going to have in the credibility of this country, frankly.
Chief Economics Correspondent from the New York Times, Ben Castleman, thank you very much for coming on this morning.